9/11 were orchestrated by our own leaders, and that they did this to provide the justification, the fear, and the funding for the so-called war on terror, which would be used as a pretext for enlarging the empire. I will illustrate this point with one of the most brazen examples of the use of 9/11 to get funding. Shortly before the current Bush administration took office, about a year before, a document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses was published by an organization called the Project for the New American Century, founding members of which included Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and Donald Rumsfeld. This document focused primarily on getting more tax monies allocated for the technological transformation of the U.S. military, with the centerpiece of this technological transformation being the U.S. Space Command's project to weaponize and thereby control space. Because this transformation of the U.S. military will be very expensive, the document said, it will probably proceed very slowly unless America suffers some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. It is interesting that then on the night of 9/11 itself, President Bush reportedly wrote in his diary, "The Pearl Harbor of the 21st century took place today." In any case, earlier that evening, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was on message. We might assume he would have been disoriented by the fact that the Pentagon had just, under his watch, suffered an unprecedented attack. Instead, he was ready to use the attacks to obtain more money for the U.S. Space Command. He had just before taking office, in fact, chaired the commission about the U.S. Space Command, popularly known as the Rumsfeld Commission. That evening of 9/11 itself, in front of television cameras, Rumsfeld berated Senator Carl Levin, then chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, saying, "Senator Levin, you and other Democrats in the Congress have voiced fear that you simply don't have enough money for the large increases in defense that the Pentagon is seeking, especially for missile defense. Does this sort of thing convince you that an emergency exists in this country to increase defense spending?" The strategy worked. Congress immediately appropriated an additional $40 billion for the Pentagon. Since then, furthermore, the President has gotten every additional appropriation he has sought for the so-called war on terror. Besides being a rousing success in obtaining increased spending for military purposes, 9/11 also provided the pretext for putting many military bases in Central Asia. Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, had said that doing so would be crucial for maintaining American primacy, partly because of the huge oil reserves around the Caspian Sea. Indeed, the Project for the New American Century may have gotten its idea that a new Pearl Harbor would be helpful from this book. Brzezinski, explaining that the American public had supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, suggested that Americans today would support the needed military operations in Central Asia only in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. And indeed, thanks to the attacks of 9/11, the Bush administration was able to carry out its plans to attack Afghanistan, a plan that we now know had been formulated several months before 9/11. The White House now has a friendly government in Afghanistan, and the Pentagon has military bases there and in several of the other countries in Central Asia. We also know that the intention to invade Iraq existed long before 9/11, and that this intention was based on imperial designs not discussed with Saddam's wickedness. In the Project for the New American Centuries 2000 document, we read, "While the unresolved conflict with Iraq provides the immediate justification, the need for a substantial American force presence in the Gulf transcends the issue of the regime of Saddam Hussein." The U.S. military is now intending to build several permanent bases in Iraq, which has the world's second largest known supply of oil reserves. The attacks of 9/11 again provided the pretext as the Bush administration deceived a majority of the American people into believing that Saddam was connected with Osama bin Laden and even directly responsible for the attacks of 9/11. I suggested earlier that seeing the true connections between 9/11 and the global domination project helps us understand how fully this project reflects fanaticism based on a deeply perverted value system. This is a value system that is diametrically opposed to the value systems on which all the great religious and moral traditions of the world have been based. These traditional value systems say that we should not covet, steal, and murder, that we should make sure that everyone has the necessary means for a decent life. But our government's project for global domination is carried out in the name of the haves of the world who want still more, even if it means killing hundreds of thousands of people and letting millions more die every year because of starvation and other poverty-related diseases. We can now see furthermore that some political and military leaders are so fanatically infected with these perverted values that they are willing to kill thousands of their own citizens, then endlessly use a deceptive account of these terrorist attacks to justify a war on terror, in the name of which they claim the right to do virtually anything they wish, ignoring all principles of international law and morality. I turn now, finally, to the question, how should religious people respond to 9/11 and the American empire? My discussion of this question must be very brief, consisting merely of 4 suggestions. First, discover and then speak the truth. I would suggest that religious people should, if they have not done so already, study about both 9/11 and the American empire to see if they find the claims I have made here true. If they do, then they should do everything they can to make others aware of these facts. Second, create new means to spread the truth. It is clear that the mainstream press in America is complicit in the cover-up of the truth about the American empire in general and 9/11 in particular. For example, my second book, which exposes many outrageous lies, has not been reviewed by a single mainstream newspaper, magazine, television station, so on. There are, of course, alternative publications, both in print and on the internet, that seek to expose the truth about the American empire. Most of these, however, fail to deal with 9/11, and most of them are indifferent to or even hostile to religion. So they do not provide effective organs to communicate with religious communities. Perhaps the most important thing that religious groups concerned with getting the truth about 9/11 out could do is to create new means of communication, means through which the contrast between the values of the religious traditions and the values of the global domination project can be made clear. On this basis, an ecumenical religious movement to oppose the global domination project partly by exposing the truth about 9/11, might be formed. Third, formulate proposals for subverting the global domination project. As such a movement begins to form, it will need to decide rather concretely how to go about trying to subvert the global domination project. Another thing we need from religious thinkers of the various traditions, therefore, are proposals for how to do this. I will soon be publishing, I hope, my own proposal, which is centered around the idea of global democracy. Other people will favor different proposals. But I stress the importance of having proposals from religious thinkers. It is probably only such proposals, drawing explicitly on the moral principles of the religious traditions, that will have the power to move large numbers of people around the world. Fourth, form alliances with other moral, non-governmental organizations, generally called NGOs. I have emphasized that it is important for representatives from the various religious traditions to join forces. Indeed, my motto is, religions of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your impotence. But it is essential at the same time for these religious groups to forge alliances with what we can call the other moral NGOs of the world. Whether they are working for human rights, for peace, for ecological sustainability, or some related cause, the moral principles that motivate these NGOs are diametrically opposed to the values of the global domination project. By emphasizing the moral principles that we have in common, organizations that are and are not explicitly religious can join forces in opposing that radically immoral project. I will close with the observation that insofar as Americans participate in this anti-imperial movement, their activities will be deeply patriotic because they will be seeking to call our nation back to its moral ideals, which stand our moral ideals, which stand diametrically opposed to the values implicit in the global domination project. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
First one, my 15-year-old daughter wanted to be here, but she's in at a Spanish test tomorrow. Her question is, the U.S. military is running out of troops. A draft seems to be in the offing, but probably wouldn't be accepted by the people without another 9/11 type event. A WMD attack, perhaps. Do you see signs of this coming?
That's a very frightening thought coming from a 15-year-old, isn't it? Knows what's going on. Because the problem is, as she suggests, if a draft is started, then we do have Vietnam. And that's what they learned. If you have a draft, then you get movements on university campuses that get a lot of publicity, and they don't want that. So they've tried using high-tech technology, but boy, when you invade and occupy, you need a lot of troops, as they learned. So they tried mercenaries, but the mercenaries from the other countries are mostly going home now, so what are we going to do? So I'm afraid she's right that the thought of another new Pearl Harbor may be an option.
Perish the thought.
Perish the thought.
Okay, next, what is your opinion of Mike Rupert's work in Crossing the Rubicon? specifically about mock fake